The flight to OWHER 228 souls boarded that flight on a Tuesday morning that seemed ordinary in every way. The sky was clear, the runway smooth, and passengers settled into their seats with the casual indifference of routine travel. None of them knew they were about to become part of the most extraordinary love story ever told. Only one person would survive to tell this tale, and her name was Elena Rodriguez. This is not just another survival story. This is not just another romance. This is the true account of how destiny orchestrates the impossible, how love finds us in our darkest moments, how sometimes we must lose everything to find what we were always meant to discover. Elena Rodriguez was 32 years old when she made the decision that would change her life forever. She was a successful architect living in Washington, the corner office overlooking the bustling city she had called home for over a decade. To anyone looking, from the outside, Elena had everything a modern woman could want. A thriving career, a beautiful apartment in Villa Maddalena, friends who envied her independence, and the kind of freedom that comes with financial stability. But success, as Elena had learned the hard way, could not fill the empty space in her heart. For 3 years, Elena had been carrying the weight of a love that had shattered her completely. Richard had been her everything, the man she believed would be her forever. They had planned a life together, talked about children, even put a deposit on a house in the suburbs. But love, Elena discovered, is not always enough to keep two people together when one of them is not ready to choose commitment over convenience. Richard left her for someone younger, someone who fit better into his family's expectations, someone who would never challenge him the way Elena did. The betrayal had cut deeper than Elena thought possible. It wasn't just the loss of Richard that devastated her. It was the loss of faith and love itself. She had given everything to that relationship, opened her heart completely, believed in the fairy tale that everyone deserves their happily ever after. When it ended, Elena felt like a fool for believing that love could conquer all. For months, after the breakup, Elena threw herself into work with an intensity that worried her friends. She took on the most challenging projects, worked 16-hour days, traveled constantly for business meetings, anything to avoid the silence of her apartment, anything to escape the memories that seemed to lurk in every corner of her life. But no amount of success could fill the void that Richard had left behind. Then came the night that everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and Elena was alone in her office while the rest of Washington celebrated the weekend. She was reviewing blueprints for a luxury hotel when her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an Instagram post from Richard. He was announcing his engagement to the woman he had left Elena for. The photo showed them on a beach in Maldives, both smiling radiantly. Her left hand prominently displayed with a diamond ring that sparkled in the sunset light. Elena stared at that photo for a long time. She felt something break inside her chest, but it wasn't her heart this time. It was the last chain that had been keeping her tied to a life that no longer served her. In that moment, sitting alone in her office, while her city sparkled below, Elena made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew her. She was going to leave everything behind. The idea came to her like lightning striking clear sky. She would take all the vacation days she had accumulated over the years, all the sick days she had never used, and she would go somewhere far away. Somewhere she had never been, somewhere that held no memories of Richard or the life they had planned together. She wanted to disappear completely, to reinvent herself in a place where nobody knew her story. That night, Elena went home and opened her laptop. She didn't have a destination in mind, didn't have a plan. She simply went to the airline website and looked at the departures for the next day. There were flights to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, to places she had only seen in travel magazines. But none of them called to her. None of them felt like escape. Then she saw it. A flight with an unusual itinerary, one that would take her from Washington to Cairo, with connections through 3 different countries. The flight path would cross over the Sahara Desert, over ancient lands that held stories older than civilization itself. Something about that route spoke to Elena's broken heart. The desert represented emptiness, solitude, the kind of vast silence, where a person could lose themselves completely and maybe, just maybe, find themselves again. Before she could change her mind, Elena booked the ticket. She didn't research her destination, didn't make hotel reservations, didn't tell anyone about her plans. She simply bought a one-way ticket to Cairo, packed a single suitcase with clothes that could take her anywhere, and wrote resignation letters to her clients that she would send after. Take off. If you're watching this story unfold and finding yourself completely captivated by Elena's journey, you're about to witness something that will challenge everything you believe about fate and destiny. Before we continue with what happens next, I need you to do something that will ensure you don't miss a single moment of this incredible tale. Right now, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this story has 10 chapters that will take you on an emotional roller coaster unlike anything you've ever experienced. Each chapter reveals more shocking details about Elena's survival and the mysterious man who saved her life. And if you're already feeling the power of this story, show your support by hitting the like button, because your engagement helps this remarkable true story reach people all over the world who need to hear that real love still exists. Trust me, by the end of Elena's journey, you'll understand why this story has already changed thousands of lives, and why you'll want to share it with everyone you care about. The next morning, Elena woke up before dawn with a strange sense of peace. She had slept better than she had in months, as if her subconscious knew that she had finally chosen a path forward. She showered, dressed in comfortable clothes for the long journey ahead, and took one last look around the apartment that had been her sanctuary and her prison for so many years. At Washington's International Airport, Elena felt like she was walking through a dream. Everything seemed surreal, from the early morning light filtering through the terminal windows to the weight of her passport in her hand. She had traveled for business many times before, but this felt different. This felt like she was crossing a threshold from one life into another. The first leg of her journey took her to Madrid, where she had a 6-hour layover. Elena spent the time walking through the airport, observing other travelers, wondering about their stories and destinations. Everyone seemed to know where they were going and why. Elena was the only one traveling into the unknown. That thought both thrilled and terrified her. The second flight took her to Istanbul, another layover. Another chance to contemplate the magnitude of what she was doing. She called her sister from the airport, told her she was taking an extended vacation and would be out of touch for a while. She didn't mention that she had quit her job or that she had no return ticket. Some decisions are too big to explain over the phone. Finally, she boarded the last flight, the one that would take her over the Sahara Desert to Cairo. As the plane lifted off from Istanbul, Elena felt the final cords connecting her to her old life snap. She was truly free now, flying into uncertainty with nothing but hope and a broken heart that maybe, somewhere in the vastness ahead, could learn to heal. The flight was peaceful at first. Elena had a window seat, and as the landscape below changed, from the green hills of Turkey to the endless gold of the Sahara, she felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was possibility. For the first time since Richard had left, Elena felt like she could breathe fully. She dozed off somewhere over the desert, lulled by the steady hum of the engines and the gentle turbulence that comes with flying over such vast expanses. In her dreams, she was walking through sand dunes under a sky full of stars, and someone was calling her name from far away. She couldn't see who it was, but the voice was warm and familiar, like coming home after a long journey. Elena woke up to screaming. The plane was shaking violently. Oxygen masks had dropped from the ceiling, and passengers were crying and praying in languages she didn't understand. The flight attendants were shouting instructions, but their voices were barely audible over the sound of alarms and the terrible groaning of metal under stress. Through her window, Elena could see that they were flying dangerously low over the desert. The sand dunes looked close enough to touch. She could see the shadow of their plane racing across the golden surface like a dark omen. The engines were making sounds that engines should never make. The cabin was filled with smoke and the smell of burning electronics. In those final moments before impact, Elena thought about Richard. She thought about the life she had left behind, the career she had abandoned, the sister she might never see again. But strangely, she didn't feel regret. She felt something that might have been peace, or maybe just acceptance. If this was how her story ended, at least she had chosen to write the final chapter herself. The last thing Elena remembered before everything went black was the sight of golden sand rushing toward her window, and the impossible thought that somehow this wasn't really the end. Somehow, this was just the beginning of something she could never have imagined. 227 people died when Flight 447 crashed into the Sahara Desert that Tuesday afternoon. The impact was so severe that investigators later said it was a miracle the plane didn't completely disintegrate. Scattered across nearly half a mile of desert, the wreckage told the story of an aircraft that had fought valiantly against forces beyond its control before succumbing to the inevitable. But miracles, as Elena was about to discover, sometimes come disguised as disasters. And sometimes, to find the love of your life, you first have to lose everything else. 50 miles away from the crash site, in gardens that bloomed impossibly green against the desert backdrop, a man stood on a balcony watching smoke rise from the horizon. He was tall and lean, with the kind of natural elegance that comes from generations of royal breeding. His name was Prince Khalil al-Rashid, and in 35 years of life, he had never felt his heart skip a beat for any woman. But as he watched that distant smoke and felt an inexplicable pull toward the tragedy unfolding beyond his sight, deep in his chest told him that his life was about to change forever. He had no way of knowing that somewhere in that wreckage, a woman was taking her first breath in a new world where impossible love stories come true. This is where Elena's real journey begins. 228 souls, 1 mile race. The impact lasted only 7 seconds. But those 7 seconds contained an entire lifetime of terror, hope, and impossible physics that would later baffle aviation experts around the world. When Flight 447 hit the Sahara Desert at 2:47 in the afternoon, local time, it was traveling at a speed that should have turned everything inside into dust. The cockpit voice recorder, recovered weeks later, captured the final words of Captain Ahmad Hassan as he fought to save his aircraft. His last transmission was a prayer in Arabic, followed by the sound of metal tearing, apart like paper in a hurricane. The official investigation would take 18 months to complete. What the investigators found defied every computer model they ran, every simulation they created, every precedent in aviation disaster history. The plane had hit the sand at an angle that was mathematically impossible to survive. Yet somehow, impossibly, one section of the fuselage had remained intact. Row 23 through 27 had been sheared away from the rest of the aircraft and had tumbled across the desert like a massive metal cylinder, finally coming to rest against a sand dune that had absorbed the impact like a giant cushion. Placed there by divine intervention, Elena Rodriguez had been sitting in seat 2-4C, a window seat that she had specifically chosen so she could watch the desert pass beneath her. In those final moments before impact, as the plane descended at an impossible angle and passengers around her screamed in terror, Elena had pressed her face against that window and made peace with her death. She had whispered a prayer to her grandmother, the woman who had raised her and taught her that everything happens for a reason, even the things that break our hearts. But Elena didn't die. When consciousness returned to her, it came in waves of pain and confusion that felt like drowning in reverse. First, there was the taste of blood and sand in her mouth. Then the sound of wind whistling through twisted metal. Finally, the unbearable weight of something pressing against her left arm, trapping her in a space barely large enough for her body. She tried to move, and immediately, she understood that something was very wrong. Her left arm was pinned beneath a section of aircraft seat, and every attempt to free herself sent lightning bolts of agony through her shoulder and down her spine. Body was covered in cuts from flying debris, and her clothes were torn and soaked with blood that she couldn't tell was hers or someone else's. But she was alive. Against every law of physics and probability, Elena Rodriguez was breathing, thinking, and feeling pain, which meant she had survived something that no human being should have been able to survive. The silence around her was absolute in a way that city dweller Elena had never experienced. There were no car horns, no construction noise, no conversations from neighboring apartments. There was only the sound of wind moving across sand and the occasional groan of settling metal as the wreckage continued to shift in the desert heat. Elena's first coherent thought was that she needed to find other survivors. Surely, she couldn't be the only one. Surely someone else had lived through this impossible crash. She called out, her voice cracking from thirst and trauma, but the desert swallowed her words without echo. She tried again, louder this time, screaming names of passengers she remembered. From the boarding process, Maria, who had been traveling to visit her grandchildren, David, the businessman who had helped her lift her carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, Ahmed, the young father who had shown her pictures of his twin daughters. No one answered. The silence that came back to her was so complete, so final, that Elena understood with horrible clarity that she was alone.
Out of 28
People who had boarded that flight in Istanbul, she was the only one still breathing. The psychological impact of that realization was almost worse than her physical injuries. Elena had always been someone who drew strength from others, who thrived in the company of friends and colleagues. The idea of being completely alone in one of the most desolate places on Earth was so overwhelming that for several minutes, she simply closed her eyes and wished she had died with the others. But survival, Elena was about to learn, is not a choice we make with our minds. It's a decision our bodies make for us, programmed into our cells by millions of years of evolution. Even as her conscious mind wanted to give up, her body was already beginning the process of staying alive. Her heart kept beating, her lungs kept drawing air. Her brain kept solving the immediate problems of survival. The first problem was freeing her arm from the wreckage. Elena could feel that it was broken, probably in more than one place. But she also knew that if she didn't get free soon, dehydration would kill her long before rescue arrived. Using her right hand and her legs, she began the excruciating process of lifting the twisted metal that had her trapped. It took her nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of pushing and pulling and crying out in pain as jagged edges cut into her skin. 2 hours of fighting unconsciousness as waves of agony threatened to drag her under. But finally, miraculously, her arm came free, and Elena was able to crawl out of the wreckage and into the blazing afternoon sun of the Sahara Desert. What she saw when she emerged from the twisted metal made her stomach lurch with horror and disbelief. The wreckage was scattered across nearly half a mile of sand. Pieces of aircraft and luggage and things she didn't want to identify, creating a trail of destruction that looked like the aftermath of a war. The main section of the fuselage was completely destroyed, crushed into pieces no larger than automobiles. There were no other intact sections, no other pockets where someone might have survived. Elena was looking at the grave of 227 people, and she was the only mourner at their funeral. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, but the heat was still overwhelming. Elena's survival training, limited to what she had seen in movies and read in books, told her that she needed to find shelter and water, and she needed to find them quickly. The desert at night would be as deadly as the desert during the day. Just in the opposite direction, she began searching through the wreckage, looking for anything that might help her survive until rescue arrived. She found several bottles of water that had somehow remained unbroken, a few packages of airline peanuts, and a blanket that had been thrown clear of the main impact. These supplies wouldn't last long, but they gave her hope that she might live long enough to be found. As Elena gathered these items, fighting waves of dizziness from her head injury and nausea from the pain in her arm, she began to notice something strange about her memory. She could remember the crash, could remember her life in Washington, could remember Richard and the heartbreak that had sent her on this journey. But there were gaps, empty spaces where recent memories should have been.
She couldn't remember.
Checking into the hotel in Istanbul during her layover, she couldn't remember what she had eaten for breakfast on the morning of the flight. Most disturbing of all, she couldn't remember why she had been going to Cairo in the first place. The doctors would later explain that this type of selective amnesia is common in severe trauma cases. The brain protects itself by blocking access to memories that are too painful or too recent to process. But standing alone in the Sahara Desert, Elena didn't understand what was happening to her. She only knew that pieces of herself seemed to be missing, as if the crash had taken more than just her physical safety. If you're watching Elena's story and feeling your heart break for this incredibly brave woman, you need to understand that what happens next will restore your faith in the power of human connection and divine timing. But before we reveal the miraculous rescue that's coming, I need you to become part of Elena's journey by subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell. This story has 9 more chapters that will take you from the depths of despair to the heights of a love story so powerful it will change how you think about destiny. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in miracles, because Elena's survival is just the beginning of something that will prove that. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we were always meant to discover, and if you're already feeling the emotional impact of this incredible true story, hit that like button to help us share Elena's journey with people all over the world who are searching for hope in their darkest moments. As the sun began to set over the wreckage, Elena realized that her biggest challenge wasn't going to be the physical demands of survival. It was going to be the mental battle against despair. She was injured, alone, and lost in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with no idea if anyone even knew her plane had crashed. Much less where to look for survivors, she made a shelter using pieces of the aircraft and the blanket she had found, creating a small space that would protect her from the wind and help retain her body heat during the cold desert night. As she worked, ignoring the screaming pain in her arm and the dizziness that kept threatening to knock her unconscious, Elena found herself talking to her grandmother. Her grandmother had died when Elena was 25, but she had been the strongest influence in Elena's life. A woman who had survived the Great Depression, raised 6 children alone after her husband died in World War II, and never lost her faith that everything happens for a reason. If her grandmother could survive losing everything and still believe in God's plan, Elena told herself, then she could survive this. As darkness fell over the desert, the temperature dropped with shocking suddenness. Elena wrapped herself in the blanket and sipped tiny amounts of water, trying to make her supplies last as long as possible. The stars that appeared overhead were more brilliant than any she had ever seen, unmarked by city lights or atmospheric pollution. Under any other circumstances, Elena would have found them beautiful. Tonight they only reminded her of how small and alone she was. Sleep was impossible. Between the pain of her injuries, the cold that seemed to seep into her bones despite the blanket, and the psychological trauma of being the sole survivor of such a devastating crash, Elena spent the night drifting in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she dreamed she was back in her apartment in Washington, safe and warm and surrounded by familiar sounds. Sometimes she dreamed she was still on the plane. The crash hadn't happened yet, and she could warn everyone to brace for it. Impact, but mostly. She lay awake listening to the wind and trying not to think about how long it might take for rescue teams to find her, or if they would find her at all. The investigation later revealed that Flight 447 had disappeared from radar contact 18 minutes before the crash. When electrical problems caused by a severe sandstorm had knocked out most of the aircraft's communication systems, air traffic control had lost all contact with the plane, and when it failed to arrive in Cairo on schedule, search and rescue teams didn't know where to begin looking. The last confirmed position had been over 1,000 square miles of empty desert, an area so vast that finding wreckage would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, the size of a small country. Elena didn't know any of this, as she shivered through her first night in the Sahara. She didn't know that search planes were already looking for her, or that her sister in Washington was fielding calls from airline officials, who couldn't explain what had happened to Flight 447. She didn't know that her survival was being called impossible by aviation experts who couldn't understand how anyone could have lived through such a catastrophic impact. All Elena knew was that she was alive. She was alone, and she needed to stay strong long enough for help to arrive. What she couldn't possibly know was that help was already on the way, in a form she never could have imagined 50 miles to the east. In a palace that rose from the desert like something out of an Arabian fairy tale, Prince Khalil al-Rashid was preparing for a rescue mission that would change his life forever. He had spent the entire afternoon organizing search teams, dispatching helicopters, and coordinating with international rescue services. But as night fell, and no survivors had been found, Khalil made a decision that his advisors thought was insanely dangerous. He was going to search for survivors himself, on foot, using navigation skills passed down through generations of Bedouin. Ancestors who had learned to read the desert like other men read books. The wreckage was out there somewhere in his family's ancestral lands. If there were people who needed help, he would find them. What Prince Khalil didn't know, as he prepared for the most important journey of his life, was that somewhere in the darkness ahead of him, a woman was fighting for her life and dreaming of a voice calling her name across the sand. A voice that sounded warm and familiar, like coming home after a very long journey. The desert was about to witness a meeting that would defy every rule of probability and prove that sometimes the most impossible love stories are the only ones worth telling. The Prince of the Sand Sin, the heart of the Sahara Desert, where most maps show nothing but empty space, there exists a kingdom that the modern world has forgotten. It has no official borders recognized by the United Nations, no flag flying at international summits, no ambassador speaking at global conferences. Yet for over 800 years, the Al-Rashid dynasty has ruled these endless dunes with a wisdom that has kept their people prosperous, their culture intact, and their secrets safe from the outside world. The Palace of the Seven Winds rises from the desert like a mirage made real, its golden walls catching the first light of dawn and the last rays of sunset in a display that has inspired poets and mystics for centuries. Built around natural oases that bubble up from underground springs, the palace complex houses nearly 3,000 people. From members of the royal family to scholars, artisans, and the Bedouin families who have served the Al-Rashids since the time of the Crusades. On the morning of the crash, Prince Khalil Al-Rashid had awakened before dawn, as was his custom, for the morning prayer that would guide his day.
Damn.
At 35, he was considered by many to be the most eligible bachelor. In the Arab world, though few outside his kingdom knew of his existence, tall and lean with the classical features of his Bedouin ancestors, Khalil possessed the kind of natural authority that comes from generations of leadership bred into his very bones. But unlike the princes who filled the tabloids and social media feeds of the modern world, Khalil had never courted fame or fortune. His wealth was legendary, his influence vast. Yet he lived according to the ancient codes of his forefathers, where honor mattered more than headlines and duty superseded desire. He spoke 7 languages fluently, held degrees from Oxford and the Sorbonne, and could navigate the desert by the stars as easily as his ancestors had done 1,000 years before. Yet for all his accomplishments, all his responsibilities, all the respect he commanded from his people, there was an emptiness in Khalil's life that he had never been able to fill. He had been engaged twice, both times to suitable women from noble families, both times ending the engagements himself when he realized that duty alone could not create the kind of love he had seen between his parents. His mother, Queen Amina, had often told him the story of how she had met his father. She had been a nurse working with refugees in Syria when the then Prince Omar had arrived with a convoy of aid supplies. Their eyes had met across a crowded medical tent, and she later said it was like recognizing someone she had known in a previous life. Within 6 months, she had converted to Islam, learned Arabic, and married the man who would make her a queen. Their love story had become legend in the kingdom, a reminder that true love transcends all boundaries. Khalil had spent his adult life searching for that kind of connection, that moment of recognition his mother had described. He had met beautiful women, intelligent women, accomplished women from across the globe. But never had he felt that spark of destiny, that sense of coming home to someone he had been searching for without. Knowing he was searching, his advisors had long since given up trying to arrange suitable marriages for him. His younger brother Rashid had married and produced 3 sons, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty. The pressure on Khalil to marry for political alliance had lessened, but the loneliness in his heart had only grown deeper. At 35, he had begun to wonder if the kind of love his parents shared was a once-in-a-generation miracle, not something he could expect to find for himself. On this particular morning, Khalil had completed his prayers and was reviewing reports from his ministers when his head of security, Colonel Hassan, brought news that would change everything. A commercial airliner had crashed somewhere in their territory during the night. International search and rescue teams were being mobilized, but the crash site was deep in the desert. Far from any roads or established flight paths, Khalil's first instinct was to offer every resource at his disposal to help with the rescue efforts. The Al Rashid Kingdom might not appear on modern maps, but their obligation to help those in need was absolute. Within minutes of receiving the news, Khalil had authorized the deployment of their most advanced helicopters, their best desert rescue teams, and their most skilled trackers. But as the morning progressed and reports came back from the initial search flights, it became clear that this was no ordinary aviation accident. The wreckage was scattered across miles of desert, the impact so severe that investigators were calling it unsurvivable. The aircraft had been completely destroyed. The debris spread in a pattern that suggested a catastrophic mid-air breakup followed by ground impact at tremendous speed. Khalil stood on the balcony of his private chambers, looking out across the desert that had been his family's home for 8 centuries, and felt something he had never experienced before. It was more than concern for potential survivors, more than duty to provide assistance. It was a pull, a certainty that he needed to be personally involved in the search, that somehow his presence was required in a way he couldn't explain or rationalize. His advisors thought he was being reckless. Colonel Hassan argued that it was too dangerous for the Crown Prince to venture into such remote territory, especially when early reports suggested there were no survivors to rescue. His younger brother Rashid pointed out that Khalil could coordinate rescue efforts much more effectively from the palace, using their communication systems and aerial surveillance. But Khalil had learned to trust his instincts. The same instincts that had guided his ancestors across trackless desert for generations. Something was calling him to that crash site, something beyond duty or curiosity. For the first time in his adult life, he was going to follow his heart instead of his advisor's counsel. By noon, Khalil had assembled a small search party consisting of himself, 2 of his most trusted guards, and Ahmed al-Saba, the best desert tracker in the kingdom. They would travel light and fast, using traditional methods that would allow them to cover ground that helicopters couldn't safely navigate. Ahmed had studied the crash reports and calculated that the main impact site was approximately 50 miles northwest of the palace, in an area of the desert known for its shifting dunes and unpredictable sandstorms. As they prepared to depart, Khalil's mother came to see him off. Queen Amina was 62 years old, but still possessed the striking beauty and sharp intelligence that had captured a prince's heart decades earlier. She had been born in Damascus to a middle-class family, but she had adapted to royal life with a grace that had made her beloved by her adopted people. Looking at her son as he checked his equipment and supplies, Queen Amina felt a strange stirring in her heart. She had learned to read the desert's moods during her years as queen, had developed an intuition about the forces that moved through the ancient lands of her adopted home. Today she sensed that Khalil was riding toward more than a rescue mission. He was riding toward his destiny. The journey began in the early afternoon, when the sun was at its most punishing, but the day's heat would give way to cooler evening temperatures as they traveled. Khalil rode his Arabian stallion Zahir, a magnificent black horse that had been bred in the royal stables and trained for desert endurance. His guards rode similar mounts, while Ahmed traveled on a camel that could cover vast distances without water and navigate terrain that would challenge even the finest horses. As they moved across the landscape, Khalil found his mind wandering to places it had never gone before. He thought about his parents' love story, about the moment of recognition his mother had described. He thought about the emptiness in his own life, the sense that he was waiting for something he couldn't name. Most strangely of all, he found himself thinking about dreams he had been having lately, dreams of a woman with dark hair and sad eyes, who seemed to be calling to him across great distances. The dreams had started several weeks ago. Always the same scenario. He would be riding across the desert at night, following a star that seemed brighter than the others. In the distance, he would hear a woman's voice calling his name, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. When he tried to ride toward the voice, it would fade away, and he would wake up feeling like he had lost something important. If you're finding yourself completely captivated by Prince Khalil's story and sensing that something extraordinary is about to happen, you're witnessing the setup for one of the most incredible love stories ever documented. But before we reach the moment that will change both Elena and Khalil's lives forever, I need you to do something that will ensure you experience every breathtaking detail of what happens next. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications, because this story has 7 more chapters that will take you on an emotional journey unlike anything you've ever experienced. The moment when Khalil finds Elena in the wreckage is just minutes away, and their first look into each other's eyes will prove that destiny exists and that true love can bloom in the most impossible circumstances. Share this incredible true story with everyone you know who believes in the power of love, and hit that like button to help us spread this message of hope to people all around the world who need to believe that miracles still happen. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Ahmed suddenly raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. The tracker dismounted from his camel and knelt in the sand, examining something that only his trained eye could see. After several minutes, he looked up at Khalil with an expression of grim certainty. They were close. The crash site was less than 2 miles ahead in a depression between 2 large dune formations that would have hidden it from aerial searches. Ahmed could see the disturbed sand patterns that indicated a massive impact, and his experienced nose could detect the faint smell of aviation fuel and burned metal carried on the desert breeze. As they crested the final dune, the crash site came into view. Even Khalil, who had seen the aftermath of desert battles and tribal conflicts, was stunned by the scope of destruction spread out below them. The aircraft had been completely obliterated, scattered across nearly half a mile in pieces no larger than automobiles. It looked less like a plane crash than like a bombing site, as if the very earth had exploded upward to swallow the aircraft and everything in it. The 4 men descended into the crash zone in respectful silence, each understanding that they were entering a graveyard. This was not a rescue mission anymore. This was a recovery operation, a chance to bring closure to the families of the victims and perhaps answer questions about what had caused such a catastrophic failure. They had been searching through the wreckage for nearly an hour, finding nothing but twisted metal and debris, when one of Khalil's guards called out from the eastern edge of the impact zone. He had found something that didn't belong with the rest of the destruction. A section of aircraft fuselage, 5 rows of passenger seating, had somehow separated from the main aircraft and tumbled nearly 200 yards from the primary impact site. The section was damaged but intact, and there were signs that someone had been moving around it recently. Khalil approached the wreckage section with his heart hammering in his chest. He could see disturbed sand around what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from aircraft debris and a blue blanket. There were empty water bottles nearby, and scratch marks in the metal that suggested someone had fought their way out of the wreckage from the inside. Then he heard it. A sound so faint, he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. A human voice, weak and barely audible, calling out in what sounded like English. The voice was female, young, and filled with a desperation that cut through Khalil's heart like a blade. He followed the sound to the makeshift shelter and carefully moved aside the debris that served as its entrance. What he saw inside would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. A young woman, probably in her early 30s, with long dark hair matted with blood and sand. Left arm was clearly broken, held against her body with strips of fabric torn from her clothes. Her face and exposed skin were covered in cuts and bruises. But her eyes, when they focused on his face, were the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Elena and Khalil simply looked at each other. She saw a tall, handsome man in traditional Arab dress, with kind eyes and an expression of concern that seemed genuine. He saw a woman who looked like she had been through hell, but had somehow maintained a dignity and strength that took his breath away. Elena tried to speak, to ask who he was, and if help was coming, but only a whisper emerged from her parched throat. Khalil understood immediately what she needed and reached for his water flask, supporting her head gently as he helped her drink. The simple act of kindness, the careful way he held her, the concern in his dark eyes broke through Elena's defenses. In a way that surprised them both, she began to cry, not from pain or fear, but from relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning in reverse. She had survived the impossible, had lived through a night she thought would be her last. And now this stranger had appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. Khalil felt something shift inside his chest as he watched. Tears tracked through the dust on her cheeks. This was the woman from his dreams. He realized with a certainty that defied logic. This was the voice that had been calling his name across the desert nights. This was the reason he had felt compelled to come here himself, instead of sending others. Looking into Elena's eyes as she tried to thank him in broken Arabic, Khalil experienced what his mother had described all those years ago: recognition. The sense of coming home to someone he had known in a previous life. The certainty that his search was over, that the emptiness in his heart had just been filled by a woman he had never met but had been waiting for his entire life. Neither of them spoke the same language. But in that moment, words were unnecessary. Elena saw in Khalil's eyes the same recognition she was feeling. This stranger who had saved her life was somehow familiar, somehow exactly who she needed him to be. The connection between them was immediate and inexplicable, a bond that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with destiny. As Khalil carefully lifted Elena from the makeshift shelter and prepared to carry her to safety, he whispered a prayer of gratitude to the desert that had brought them together. He had come looking for survivors, and had found instead the other half of his soul. The sun was setting over the crash site as Prince Khalil al-Rashid began the journey back to his palace, carrying in his arms the woman who would become his queen. Neither of them knew yet how their love story would unfold, but both of them understood that their lives had just changed forever. The desert had worked another of its ancient miracles, proving once again that the most impossible love stories are always the most true. Between Life and DHN, the medical journals that would later document Elena's case, doctors would describe her condition as incompatible with life. The combination of severe dehydration, blood loss, traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, and exposure should have killed her hours before Prince Khalil found her in that makeshift shelter. Yet as he knelt beside her in the fading desert light, Elena Rodriguez was not only alive, but conscious, aware, and looking into his eyes with a clarity that defied every medical prediction. Khalil had seen death before. As a prince of a desert kingdom, he had witnessed the aftermath of tribal conflicts, natural disasters, and the harsh realities of life in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. He knew what it looked like when someone was beyond saving, when the light in their eyes was already dimming. But looking at Elena, even in her broken and battered state, he saw something that made his heart race with hope rather than despair. She was fighting. Despite everything her body had endured, despite the impossible odds she had already overcome just by surviving the crash, Elena was still fighting to live. There was a strength in her that went beyond physical resilience, a determination that seemed to burn brighter as her body grew weaker. It was this inner fire that convinced Khalil that she could be saved, that Allah had preserved her life for a reason that went beyond mere chance. But wanting to save her and being able to save her were two very different things. Elena needed medical attention that was hours away even under the best circumstances. The nearest hospital with trauma capabilities was in Cairo, over 300 miles across some of the most treacherous desert terrain in North Africa. His own kingdom's medical facilities, while excellent, were equipped for routine care rather than the kind of life-threatening emergency that Elena represented. Every minute that passed made her chances of survival smaller. Khalil could see that. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her breathing becoming more shallow, her skin taking on the grayish pallor that he recognized as the body's preparation for shutting down. If he was going to save this woman who had somehow survived the impossible, he needed to act quickly and decisively. Ahmed, the desert tracker, approached Khalil with the kind of respectful directness that came from decades of service to the royal family. The old Bedouin had seen the prince make difficult decisions before, but never under circumstances like these. Elena needed immediate evacuation, but the terrain around the crash site was too rough for helicopter landing. The nearest area suitable for aircraft was nearly 20 miles away, across sand dunes that would be treacherous to navigate in the gathering darkness. Khalil made a decision that his security detail would later describe as either inspired or insane. They would travel through the night, carrying Elena on horseback across the desert to a predetermined rendezvous point, where his personal helicopter would be waiting. It was a journey that would normally take 3 hours in daylight with healthy riders. Carrying a critically injured woman across unmarked desert in complete darkness could take twice as long, assuming they didn't get lost or encounter any of the sandstorms that frequently swept through this region after sunset. The risks were enormous. Elena might not survive the journey. It could all become lost in the trackless desert if Ahmed's navigation skills failed them. Khalil himself could be putting his life in danger, and with it the future of his entire kingdom. But as he looked down at Elena's face, pale and drawn with pain, but still beautiful in a way that took his breath away, Khalil knew he had no choice. He would risk everything to give her a chance at life. The next hour became a blur of urgent preparation. Khalil's guards fashioned a makeshift stretcher from debris and fabric, creating a way to secure Elena safely for transport.
Ahmed prepared
His camel for the additional burden, while Khalil himself took responsibility for Elena's immediate care, using supplies from their emergency kit to stabilize her broken arm and clean the worst of her wounds as he worked. Khalil found himself talking to Elena in Arabic, his voice low and soothing despite her inability to understand his words. He told her that she was safe now, that he would not let her die, that she needed to keep fighting just a little bit longer. Whether she understood the meaning or just the tone, Elena seemed to respond to his voice. Her eyes focusing on his face whenever consciousness returned to her. There was something profoundly intimate about caring for someone so vulnerable, so completely dependent on his strength and judgment. Khalil had never experienced anything like the protective instinct that Elena awakened in him. He had been responsible for the welfare of thousands of people as a prince, but this was different. This was personal in a way that went beyond duty or honor. This was about preserving something precious that the universe had placed in his hands. As the sun disappeared behind the western dunes and the desert temperature began its nightly plummet, the rescue party began their desperate journey. Elena was secured in the stretcher that had been rigged between Ahmed's camel and Khalil's horse, configuration that would allow them to travel at reasonable speed. While minimizing the jarring motion that could worsen her injuries, Khalil rode alongside the stretcher, one hand always within reach of Elena, monitoring her condition with the intensity of someone who understood that every breath she took was a victory against overwhelming odds. In the starlight, he could see her face, peaceful now in unconsciousness, and he found himself memorizing her features as if he might never see them again. The journey became a test of endurance for everyone involved. The desert at night was brutally cold, the temperature dropping 40 degrees from its daytime peak. The terrain was treacherous, with hidden rocks and sudden drop-offs that could cripple a horse or send a rider tumbling into darkness. Ahmed navigated by stars and instinct, following paths that existed more in his memory than in the physical landscape. But the greatest challenge was Elena herself. Twice during the journey, she stopped breathing entirely, and Khalil had to halt the entire party while he performed emergency resuscitation. The first time, he managed to restore her breathing through CPR techniques he had learned during his military training. The second time, she was unconscious for so long that Ahmed began reciting prayers for the dead. Convinced that their desperate journey had been in vain, it was during this second crisis, as Khalil worked frantically to revive the woman he barely knew but could not bear to lose, that he experienced something that would change his understanding of love forever. As he breathed air into Elena's lungs and compressed her chest in the rhythm he had been taught, he found himself bargaining with God in ways he had never done before. He offered his own life for hers, promised to dedicate himself entirely to her care and protection, swore oaths that went far beyond the obligations of a rescuer to a victim. When Elena's eyes suddenly opened and she gasped for air, looking directly into Khalil's face with an expression of perfect trust, he felt something lock into place in his heart that he knew would never be unlocked. In that moment, under the vast canopy of desert stars, Prince Khalil al-Rashid fell completely and irrevocably in love with a woman whose name he didn't even know. If you're watching this incredible rescue unfold and feeling your heart race with every moment of danger and every sign of hope, you're experiencing one of the most powerful love stories ever documented. But what happens next will test the limits of both Elena and Khalil's strength and prove that true love can survive challenges that would destroy ordinary relationships. Right now, Before we continue with this breathtaking journey, I need you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because the next 6 chapters will take you through Elena's recovery, the growing bond between these two extraordinary people, and the obstacles they'll face when the world discovers their impossible love story. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in miracles. And hit that like button to help us spread this incredible true story to people everywhere who are searching for proof that destiny and true love still exists in our modern world. The rendezvous point was a flat area of hard-packed sand that Khalil's family had used for generations as a camping spot during their traditional desert journeys. His helicopter crew had been waiting there for over 2 hours, the aircraft's engines kept warm and ready for immediate takeoff. As soon as they spotted the approaching party, the medical team that Khalil had insisted accompany the helicopter sprang into action. Dr. Yasmin Al-Khoury was one of the finest trauma surgeons in the Middle East, a woman who had trained at Johns Hopkins and returned to serve her homeland with skills that rivaled any Western physician. When Khalil had contacted her earlier that evening, explaining that he had found a crash survivor who needed immediate medical attention, she had asked no questions beyond what supplies she should bring and where she should meet him. Now examining Elena by the harsh light of the helicopter's medical bay, Dr. Al-Khoury understood why the prince had been so urgent in his requests. Elena's vital signs were barely detectable, her body temperature dangerously low, her blood pressure so weak that it was miraculous she was still conscious. The fact that she had survived not just the crash but also the journey across the desert spoke to a constitution that was either extraordinarily strong or supernaturally blessed. As the helicopter lifted off for the flight back to the palace, Khalil found himself in the strange position of being a passenger in his own aircraft, relegated to watching helplessly as Dr. Al-Khoury worked to stabilize Elena's condition. He had done everything he could to save her, had risked his own life and that of his men to bring her to safety. But now her survival depended on medical expertise rather than determination or courage. The flight to the Palace of the Seven Winds took 35 minutes, during which Elena's heart stopped beating twice more. Each time, Dr. Al-Khoury managed to revive her, but the effort required was becoming greater. Elena's responses weaker. By the time they touched down on the palace's private helipad, even the optimistic doctor was beginning to prepare Khalil for the possibility they might have delayed the inevitable rather than prevented it. The palace's medical wing had been transformed into a trauma center during the helicopter flight, with additional equipment flown in from the kingdom's main hospital and specialist consultants connected via video conference from medical centers around the world. Queen Amina herself had overseen the preparations, understanding without being told that this was not a routine medical emergency, but something that mattered deeply to her son. As Elena was rushed into the emergency treatment room, Khalil found himself stopped at the door by Dr. Al-Khoury's gentle but firm hand on his chest. The next few hours would determine whether Elena lived or died, and the medical team needed to work without interference, even from the crown prince of the realm. For the first time since he had found Elena in the wreckage, Khalil was forced to step back, to wait, to place his trust in others rather than his own action. It was perhaps the hardest thing he had ever done. Standing in that hospital corridor, while the woman who had somehow become the center of his universe fought for her life behind doors he could not open. Hours passed. Dawn came and went. Members of the royal household, alerted by the unusual activity, began gathering in the corridors, but Khalil barely noticed them. His entire world had contracted to the space behind those medical room doors, where Elena either lived or died based on factors beyond his control. It was nearly noon when Dr. Al-Khoury finally emerged. Exhaustion written in every line of her face, but something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. Elena had survived the surgery. To repair her internal injuries and set her broken bones, her vital signs had stabilized, her body temperature was returning to normal, and her brain showed no signs of permanent damage from the trauma or oxygen deprivation. But, Dr. Al-Khoury warned, Elena was not out of danger. The next 72 hours would be critical. Her body had endured trauma that should have been fatal, and her recovery would depend as much on her will to live as on medical intervention. She would need constant monitoring, careful nursing, and perhaps most importantly, a reason to fight her way back to full consciousness. When Khalil was finally allowed to see Elena, she looked impossibly small and fragile in the palace's finest guest bedroom, which had been converted into a private hospital room. Machines monitored her heart rate and breathing. 4 lines delivered fluids and medications, and her broken arm was immobilized in a cast that seemed almost larger than she was. But she was alive, against all odds, all medical predictions, all reasonable expectations. Elena Rodriguez had survived not just the crash, but the rescue, the journey, and the emergency surgery. As Khalil settled into the chair beside her bed, taking her uninjured hand gently in both of his, he understood that this was just the beginning of their story. Elena's eyes remained closed, her breathing steady but shallow, her face peaceful in the deep unconsciousness of medical sedation. But Khalil could swear that when he spoke to her in the soft Arabic phrases his mother had used to comfort him as a child, her fingers tightened slightly around his, as if somewhere in the darkness of her healing mind, she knew that she was safe. Outside, the window, the desert stretched endlessly toward every horizon. The same desert that had tried to claim Elena's life and had instead delivered her into Khalil's arms. The Prince of the Sands had found his princess in the most unlikely place imaginable, and now he would wait however long it took for her to wake up and begin the next chapter of the love story that destiny had written in the stars above the Sahara. In the silence of the room, broken only by the soft beeping of medical monitors and the whisper of air conditioning, Khalil made a vow that no one else could hear. He would be here when Elena woke up. He would be here for as long as she needed him. He would spend the rest of his life, if necessary, proving that miracles were real and that love could indeed conquer everything, even death itself. Awakening in a docker, the first thing Elena noticed when she woke up was the scent. It wasn't antiseptic or metallic, like the hospitals she had known in the United States. It was warm, earthy, floral-like, orange blossoms soaked in sun and honey. Her eyes fluttered open, slowly adjusting to the filtered light that poured through a high-arched window draped with white gauze. For a moment, she wondered if she was still dreaming. She was lying in a grand bed covered in soft cotton sheets, her broken arm gently immobilized in a cast and sling. Her body ached, but not in the way it had after the crash. This was different. This was healing. Her mouth was dry, her head foggy, but she was alive. Elena turned her head with effort and found herself looking at a room that could only exist in fantasy, tall ceilings adorned with carved plaster motifs, golden lamps casting, soft shadows on embroidered rugs, and vases of fresh desert flowers that perfumed the air. She felt the caress of a breeze through the window and heard the distant call to prayer echoing across the horizon. She wasn't in Snow Paulo. She wasn't in any hospital she had ever seen. She was somewhere ancient, sacred, and impossibly beautiful. A woman appeared at her bedside, a nurse, perhaps dressed in soft linen robes with a white headscarf. Her smile was gentle, and she spoke in Arabic, though Elena couldn't understand the words. But the kindness in her voice was unmistakable. The woman offered her water, which Elena drank greedily, her throat still raw. Then came the moment she'd been dreading. She tried to speak, her voice cracked. "Where am I?" The woman responded in Arabic again, but quickly stepped away, returning. Moments later, with another figure, an older man in traditional white robes who carried a tablet and spoke softly. "You are safe," he said. "You are in the palace of Prince Khalil al-Rashid. You were in an accident. The prince found you and brought you here. You have been unconscious for 3 days." Lena blinked. She tried to sit up but winced as pain flared in her side. "Easy," the man said. "You had internal bleeding, a broken arm, and a mild head trauma. But you are healing well. You are strong. Palace. Prince." Her mind reeled. Images returned in fragments. The crash, the screams, the desert heat, and a face. A man's face. Kind eyes, sun-darkened skin, the whisper of a foreign tongue, as she faded in and out of consciousness. She had thought it a dream, but now the realization crept in like morning light. He was real. Later that day, She was propped up with pillows and offered soft food. Every detail around her felt impossibly elegant. Carved wooden trays, silver spoons, crystal glasses. Yet despite the opulence, there was warmth. Everything was meant to comfort, not impress. That evening, as the sky turned indigo and the scent of jasmine grew stronger, the door opened quietly. He entered, dressed simply in white robes with a dark keffiyeh draped across his shoulders. Prince Khalil Al-Rashid was even more striking than she remembered. He stood tall and poised, but not intimidating. His gaze found hers instantly, and something in his eyes softened. "Elena," he said, his voice like velvet laced with fire. "You are awake," she swallowed. Her voice came timidly. "You're real." He smiled faintly. "I assure you, very much so." He walked to her side and sat not too close, but within reach. "I've waited for this moment. I hoped you would open your eyes. You saved me." He shook his head gently. "You survived. I only carried you." She studied his face. There was a calm wisdom there, a gentleness beneath the strength. "Why did you help?" "Me. You didn't even know me." His answer came after a pause, "'Cause I saw something in you. A will to live, a light that would not go out, and perhaps was meant to." Silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was full of questions, of mutual curiosity, of something unsaid beginning to take root. A translator entered quietly. The prince nodded, and they began to speak more easily. Him in Arabic, her in English, the translator bridging their worlds. She asked about the crash, the rescue, the people who found her. He answered with calm detail, never glorifying his role. He told her about the trek across the dunes, the nights spent fighting for her life, and how he had prayed as he never had before that she would survive. "You were unconscious," he said, "but your spirit refused to let go." She felt tears prick her eyes. "Don't remember everything. Pieces are missing. But I remember. A voice yours, calling me back." He looked down, then back at her. "Perhaps I was answering your call." That night, Elena didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the intricate patterns in the ceiling, at the stars outside the window, and at the memory of his eyes. She didn't yet know what was happening to her heart, only that it beat differently now. Over the next few days, she grew stronger, walked a little, ate more, learned to smile again. The palace was a place of silence and serenity, unlike anything she had ever known, and he was always near, sometimes watching from a distance, sometimes reading to her in Arabic, sometimes simply sitting with her in the garden, letting the silence speak for them both. She had not asked yet about going home. The world outside felt far away. One afternoon, as the call to prayer echoed through the air and doves flew overhead, she turned to him and asked softly, "Why are you still here? You're a prince. Don't you have duties?" He looked at her, edges of a smile touching his lips. "This is my duty now," she wanted to protest. But deep down, part of her didn't want to, because something unspoken had already begun to grow between them, a quiet trust, warmth, a fragile seed of affection, blooming in the desert sun. And though she didn't know it yet, she was no longer just healing. She was beginning to feel alive. Love knows no bordr. The sun rose early over the palace, casting golden threads through the intricately carved shutters of Elena's chamber. Birds sang in the garden beyond the walls, their calls weaving a soft melody into the quiet morning. Elena sat by the window, wrapped in a light shawl. Watching the light paint the desert in shades of gold and rose, she had been here for nearly 2 weeks now. Time had folded itself into strange shapes. Some days felt endless, others vanished. Before she could grasp them, her body was still recovering, but her spirit was restless. There was a sense of waiting in the air, as if the desert itself was holding its breath for something neither she nor Khalil could yet name. Her memory had begun returning in fragments, flashes of her life in Washington. Her career, her sisters, laughter, the feeling of emptiness she had tried to escape. But with every piece that returned, something curious happened. She didn't miss that life, not in the way she thought she would. The pain of betrayal, the coldness of her apartment, The endless noise of the city, they all felt distant. Like scenes from someone else's story, Khalil had become a constant presence. Not overbearing, not intrusive, but always there when she needed him. Some mornings, he would join her for breakfast in the shaded courtyard. Other times, he would read aloud from old poetry books in Arabic, translating as he went, letting the cadence of his voice carry her to places she couldn't yet reach on her own. One morning, as they sat beneath a flowering date palm, he turned to her and said, "I think it is time we stop speaking through others." She smiled. "You mean the translator?" He nodded. "Yes, I want to know you, without filters." And so began their shared lessons. Arabic for her, English for him. They met every day in the palace library, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and the scent of old paper and sandalwood. The lessons started with laughter, mispronounced words, awkward phrases, but soon gave way to real conversations. She told him about architecture, about the buildings she had dreamed of designing. He told her about the ancient irrigation systems that kept his people alive through centuries of drought. Bit by bit, wall by wall, they built a language of their own. One afternoon, after a long lesson and a silent lunch, Khalil walked with her through the royal gardens. The air was perfumed with rose and citrus, and the sound of water from a distant fountain echoed gently between the palm trees. "I once thought," he said quietly, "that my life would follow a straight path, duty, legacy, tradition, that I would marry someone chosen by the council and raise sons to continue my family's name." Elena looked at him, her steps slowing. "And now," he met her gaze, "now I understand that life is not a straight path. It is a dune, shifting, beautiful, unpredictable." She said nothing, but her hand brushed against his as they walked. A touch. So light it could have been accidental. Or not. That evening, as the palace lights glowed like stars across the courtyard, Akila invited her to dine on the rooftop terrace. Night was warm, the sky clear. A table had been set with lanterns, soft pillows, and food that smelled like heaven. Spiced lamb, saffron rice, sweet dates dipped in honey. He didn't speak of politics or tradition. Instead, he asked about her childhood, her grandmother's stories, her first drawing of a building. She asked about the stars he followed through the desert, the stories passed down from his ancestors, and somewhere between the second course and the desert, their hands met again, this time without accident, without hesitation. After dinner, he walked her back to her room. At the threshold, she paused. "This place," she said, "it's like a dream I never knew I had." "Dreams," he replied, "are sometimes more real than anything else." Their eyes lingered. She didn't kiss him, didn't lean in. But the promise hung there in the air, as tangible as the desert wind. The days that followed were lighter. They laughed more, spoke with less caution. One afternoon, she drew sketches of the palace gardens, and Khalil watched her with quiet reverence. "You bring new eyes to old stones," he said. "You make me see this place differently." She looked up, smiling. Maybe that's what we're meant to do, help each other see. But not everything was easy. Elena had moments of fear. At night, when the wind howled across the dunes, she sometimes woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the memory of the crash flashing behind her eyes. Khalil would find her sitting by the window, trembling. He never asked what haunted her. He simply brought her tea, sat beside her in silence, let her rest her head on his shoulder until the fear passed. One night, she asked, "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that fate brings us to the edge. But love is the step we take beyond it." Another time, as they watched the stars from a balcony carved with verses from ancient poets, she said, "There's still a part of me that doesn't understand this." "You, me?" He turned to her. "It doesn't need to be understood, only trusted." That trust was growing silently, like roots beneath the sand. One morning, she woke to find a small box on her table. Inside was a necklace, delicate, silver, with a single sapphire pendant. A note accompanied it, to remind you that even in the desert, the sky holds deep blue secrets. She wore it every day after that. Elena knew what was happening. She was falling in love. But it wasn't like the love she had known before, fiery, rushed, desperate. This love was slow, steady, like water carving its way through stone. And Khalil, though still guarded, was changing too. He smiled more, listened longer, walked slower when she was near. Then came the day when the outside world found her again. Call came through the palace. Her sister Anna had learned of the crash and had been searching for answers ever since. International news was filled with speculation. The authorities believed all passengers had perished. Elena was officially dead. Khalil watched her face as she took in the news. She felt the past rush back in, the life she had left behind, the funeral they must have held, the grief. You don't have to decide now, Khalil said gently. But soon. You must choose. Do you want to go back or stay? Elena stood at the edge of the terrace that evening, the wind in her hair and the necklace cold against her skin. She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming someone new. The truth re-elected happened slowly at first. A change in the air, shift in the way people looked at her as she passed through the palace halls. It's whispers in a language she had only begun to understand. Words like royal, lineage, responsibility. Elena noticed it, but chose not to confront it. Not yet. There was something sacred about the world she and Khalil had built, and she didn't want to shatter it with questions. But questions have a way of demanding answers. It was a morning like any other. Sunlight warmed the marble floor of the palace library, and Khalil sat beside her, correcting her pronunciation of Arabic verbs. He was patient, his fingers tracing words across a notebook, his voice low and encouraging. She liked the way he made her feel smart, capable, even when she stumbled. Say it again, he prompted. She did. But before she could smile back, the door opened. One of Khalil's advisors entered, bowed quickly, and spoke in hushed Arabic. Khalil's face changed, not drastically, just a flicker. A hesitation before standing. I must attend to something, he said. I'll return shortly. He left without looking back. And something in Elena's chest tightened. Later that day, she wandered into the west wing of the palace, a place she had never explored. There were portraits there. Grand paintings of men in ceremonial robes, women in gold-threaded veils, children with solemn eyes. She stopped before one painting in particular. A man who looked very much like Khalil, though older. The plaque beneath read, His Royal Highness Omar al-Rashid, Guardian of the Seven Winds, Royal Highness. The words echoed when she returned to her room. She found a folder waiting for her on the table. Inside were documents. News clippings, photos, profiles all about Khalil, his full name, his lineage, his title, Prince Khalil al-Rashid. She sat down. The floor felt unsteady beneath her, not because she didn't believe it, but because, deep down, she already knew. He had never said the words, never presented himself as anything other than a man. But the signs had been everywhere. The palace, the staff, the reverence, and now the truth was undeniable. That evening, she didn't attend dinner. She stayed in her room, her thoughts a storm. Was it deception? Was it protection? Had he doubted she could handle the truth? A knock came at the door. She didn't answer. The door opened anyway. It was him. He entered slowly, carrying no explanations. Just presence, he said. She nodded. Yes. Silence stretched. I didn't want to hide, he said. But I didn't want this to be about that. She looked at him. Then what did you want it to be about? He took a step closer. You, me, real things, not titles. You're a Prince Khalil. You have a kingdom, a people. Expectations. He sat across from her. I have never felt like a prince around you. Only like a man. She folded her hands. And what happens now? Am I supposed to bow? Am I a guest? Or ... something else? He leaned forward, voice quieter. You were the woman I carried through the desert. The woman I prayed for under the stars. The woman who made me believe again. But what about your family? Your advisors, your world. His eyes darkened. They know I follow my heart. It is the only law I trust. She felt the sting of tears, not from fear, but from the weight of it all, the impossibility, the magnitude. He reached out, took her hand. I never expected to find love, he said. Not like this, not with you. But I did, and I will protect it, whatever it takes. She looked down at their hands, her fingers in his, so different, yet so familiar. I need time, she whispered. I'll give you all you need, he said. But don't question if it's real. Yes, it is. That night, she lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed. The air smelled of jasmine. Somewhere outside, music played faintly. The truth had come, and with it 1,000 questions. But also, a strange peace in the days that followed. Things changed. Not drastically, but subtly. Invitations began to arrive. Dinners with ambassadors. Appearances in ceremonial spaces, photographers at the gates. Khalil shielded her as best he could. The palace had begun to shift. She was no longer just the woman he had rescued. She was someone people watched. One afternoon she met Queen. Amina, the queen, was elegant, poised, and carried herself like someone who had seen the world bend and break and rebuild again. She took Elena's hands in hers and studied her face. My son, she said, has always walked alone, until now. Elena didn't know what to say. Do not fear the world outside these walls, the queen said. But be ready. It is loud and cruel. But also, it listens when love speaks. They walked in the garden, speaking in slow, careful English. The queen asked about her family, her childhood, her work. Elena answered honestly. When they parted, the queen kissed her cheek. Strength comes in many forms, she said. Yours is quiet, but I see it. Later, Khalil found her beneath the olive trees. You met her, he said. She's extraordinary. So are you. She smiled faintly. He took her hand. Are you afraid? Yes, she said. But not of you, of losing what this is. You won't, he said. And for the first time, she believed him. Still, the world pressed closer. A dinner with foreign dignitaries turned into a headline. A photograph leaked. Her name appeared in articles. Speculation swirled. Back in Washington, her sister finally reached her by phone. There were tears, laughter, disbelief. You're alive, Anna said. I am. And in love with the prince? I think so, Elena cried after that call. Not from sadness, but from the strangeness of her life. Everything was true, but nothing felt real. That night, Khalil joined her on the balcony. I can make it all. Stop, he said. If you want, we can disappear. Start over. She looked at him. Would you give all this up? He didn't hesitate. Yes, for you, in a heartbeat. She touched his cheek. Then I won't ask you to. Because I wouldn't want you to lose who you are, just to have me. He kissed her forehead. Then we face it, together. The truth had been revealed. The world was watching. But in that moment, wrapped in silence, they were only two souls who had found each other against every odd. And love once spoken aloud had become undeniable. Between two worlds, the palace that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a gilded cage. Lena walked the marble corridors in silence, her footsteps echoing through spaces too grand to be intimate, too perfect to feel like home. Outside, the desert wind shifted the dunes into new shapes, as if even the landscape couldn't decide who it was supposed to be. Inside her, the same quiet storm was unfolding, a battle between who she had been, who she was becoming, and whether there was truly a place for her in this world of silk, tradition, hidden expectations. Her physical recovery had been miraculous. The doctors, amazed by her progress, had begun speaking in hushed reverence when they passed her in the halls. Elena had gone from a fragile survivor to a woman capable of walking unassisted, of speaking clearly, of thinking coherently. But the deeper wounds, the ones memory had buried, were only beginning to resurface. And with them came questions she didn't know how to answer. Each morning, Khalil came to her, sometimes with a book in Arabic, hoping to teach her a new word. Sometimes with tea from the gardens. Sometimes with nothing but silence and his steady presence. He never pressed her, never demanded answers, but his eyes always asked the question she couldn't yet answer. Would she stay? They had grown close in the quiet hours walking through the palace gardens, watching the stars from the high towers, speaking through gestures and glances more than language. But the more she learned about him, the more she feared what she represented. She was a foreigner, a woman with no name in his world, no lineage, no tradition, no place. What began as admiration turned into doubt. What if her presence was not a miracle, but a disruption? Late one evening, Elena stood at the edge of the palace balcony, the warm desert wind tugging at her loose hair. Below her, the palace grounds stretched out like a painting, perfect, serene, unreal. In the distance, the dunes shimmered under the moonlight. She closed her eyes and tried to remember Washington. Sounds of traffic, the smell of rain on concrete, the familiar rhythm of the life she had once called her own. It was all there. Hazy, but real. For the first time since the crash, she remembered her old apartment, the feeling of waking up alone on a Sunday morning. The soft jazz she used to play while making coffee. She remembered who she had been before this desert had claimed her. The return of memory was both a gift and a curse.
Oh.
With it came clarity and also responsibility.
Oh.
She now knew what she had left behind. A life, a sister, a profession. And while none of those things had been perfect, they had been hers. Here, in this palace, she was a guest. Treasured guest, yes. Loved perhaps, but not rooted. That night, she spoke to Khalil honestly for the first time since her memory had returned. Sitting beside him in the quiet of the royal library, she reached for his hand. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," she said, her voice low, but steady. "I'm from Washington. I had a life before this. A job, a home, a family." Khalil said nothing at first, simply nodded, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. She could see in his eyes that he had been waiting for this, the return of her identity. "I know," he said finally. "I've always known you had another life. But I also know that the woman who woke up in this palace is not the same woman. Who boarded that plane? You have changed, as have I." She looked away, guilt pooling in her chest. "But I don't belong here." "You belong there?" he asked gently. The question caught her off guard. Did she? Her life in Brazil had been successful, yes, but fulfilling. She remembered the emptiness, the loneliness, the aching sense that something was missing. The desperate decision to buy a ticket to nowhere. Had she truly been living, or just surviving? "I don't know," she whispered. Khalil stood and walked toward one of the tall windows that looked out over the desert. "This place," he said, "is not easy to understand. It is a world built on history, on rules, on duty. It has given me much, but it has also taken much. I do not expect you to love it as I do, but I hoped you would give it a chance." She joined him by the window, their reflections framed by the glass and the stars beyond. "I need time," she said. "Time to remember who I was and to decide who I want to be." He nodded again, but she could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, fear that time might lead her away from him in the days that followed. Alice became quieter. Khalil, ever respectful of her space, began to withdraw slightly, giving her room to think. Elena appreciated the gesture, but it also made the ache in her chest grow sharper. She missed him, even when he was only a room away. Her memories continued to return in fragments. Faces, names, places, laughter, tears. She remembered the day she graduated from university, a feeling of triumph and hope. She remembered the first time she fell in love, the first heartbreak, the countless small decisions that had shaped her into the woman who had booked that final flight. But with the memories came a new clarity. She had never felt truly seen until Khalil. He had cared for her when she was most broken, had protected her without demanding anything in return, had looked at her not as a stranger, but as someone he had always known. It was a realization that terrified her, because love, real love, was not supposed to come so suddenly, so completely. And yet, here it was, as undeniable as the desert sun. One afternoon, as she sat beneath the shade of a fig tree in the garden, Queen Amina approached. The older woman moved with the grace of someone who had once been a stranger. In this world too, She sat beside Elena, offering a small plate of dates. "I was once where you are," the queen said, her voice soft. "A foreigner, alone, unsure." Elena turned to her, surprised. "You weren't born here?" Queen Amina smiled. "No, I was born in Damascus. I met Halil's father while working with a humanitarian mission. I fell in love with the man first. The prince came later." Elena looked down at her hands. "Did you know it was right?" "I didn't," the queen said simply. "Not at first. But I chose to trust what I felt more than what I feared. Love is rarely convenient, but it is always honest." That night, Elena sat in her room for hours, staring at the suitcase she had finally packed. Not to leave, but to be ready, just in case. The contents represented a life she wasn't sure she wanted to return to. And outside that room, down long marble corridors, was a man who had given her the space to choose freely. In the end, it wasn't logic that made her decision. It wasn't even love. It was the quiet voice inside her that whispered, "You came here to find something. You found him." She stood, walked to the door, made her way through the palace until she found Khalil in the observatory where he often went to watch the stars. He turned when he heard her, and in his eyes, she saw every question he didn't dare ask. "I don't have all the answers," she said, "but I know I don't want to go back to who I was. I want to move forward with you." Khalil stepped toward her slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, even if it means leaving behind everything you once knew. She reached for his hand. "I already did, and what I found was worth it." They stood together in silence, watching the stars. Two people from different worlds. Two souls who had crossed time, tragedy, and tradition to find one another. And though the world outside there, Oasis would not understand in that moment, they didn't need it to. They had chosen each other. The choice of the heart. The morning air was cooler than usual, brushing against Elena's skin like a whispered warning. She stood alone beneath the archways of the palace garden, her fingers gently resting on the carved stone column beside her. The sun had not yet risen above the dunes, but the sky was already painted in shades of deep purple and coral, that strange in-between hour when time seems suspended. When nothing is certain and everything feels possible, she hadn't slept. The decision that had once seemed so clear, so instinctive, now pressed heavily against her chest. Stay and abandon everything she had ever known, or go and risk losing the only love that had ever made her feel truly seen. The palace was silent, but Elena's mind was a chorus of doubts and emotions. Each louder than the last, she could still feel the warmth of Halil's hands when he had held her the night before. Still hear the way he had said her name gently, reverently, like it was something sacred. And yet part of her feared it had all happened too quickly. That love born in crisis might not survive the return of routine. How could she be certain? As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned slowly and found Khalil standing there, barefoot, dressed simply, as he often did in the early hours before the court stirred. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the same turmoil that churned inside her. "You didn't sleep," he said softly. Elena shook her head. "Neither did you." Khalil nodded, then stepped closer. "I didn't come to convince you of anything. I just needed to see you. It's one last time, if that's what it is." The words struck her like a blade. One last time. The weight of possibility, of finality, hung between them. She looked away, unsure of what to say. He waited. "I was ready to stay," she whispered. "But now that the world is slowly remembering me, I feel like I'm forgetting myself." "You've remembered enough to know who you are," he replied, "and to know what you feel." "That's the problem," she said, her voice cracking. "What I feel here doesn't match the life I had before." How do I reconcile the two? Khalil exhaled deeply. "You don't. You choose. There is no reconciliation. There's only the path you want to walk." A long silence followed. In that stillness, Elena felt something shift inside her, clarity she hadn't known she needed. "What if I choose wrong?" she asked. Khalil stepped closer, his voice low and sure. "Then you will find another path. But you will never know unless you follow your heart. And mine, Elena, is already with you." He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't beg. It was never his way. Instead, he offered something far rarer. Freedom. Later that day, Elena stood by the palace gates with a small satchel in her hand. Her flight had been arranged, her documents prepared by Halil's advisors. The same men who had once looked at her with suspicion now bowed their heads, in quiet respect. A convoy waited to take her to the airfield just beyond the outer dunes. Khalil stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. He had not tried to change her mind. He had simply honored her decision, whatever it would be. "I'm not leaving because I don't love you," she said. "I know," he replied. "You're leaving because you need to understand what your life means beyond this place." Elena nodded, tears threatening to fall. "And if I find that meaning elsewhere," he met her gaze unwavering, "then I'll be grateful to have been part of your journey." The car door opened. Elena hesitated. Then slowly, she reached for Halil's hand and pressed something into his palm. It was a small pendant, a simple stone she had found in the garden during one of their walks. He had once joked that it looked like a heart. Now it pulsed with memory. She stepped into the car. The engine started. And just like that, she was gone, swallowed by the desert road. The days that followed were quiet. Khalil resumed his duties. He met with diplomats, signed decrees, oversaw agricultural reforms, but those closest to him noticed a change. A slight delay in his smile, longer pause before answering. The absence of the woman who had once brought light to his corridors left shadows in their place. Elena, too, felt the absence. She returned to Washington and found herself standing in a life that no longer fit. Her apartment was the same. City pulsed with familiar rhythm, but everything felt hollow. Conversations were polite but shallow. Friends spoke of promotions, parties, trends, none of which stirred anything inside her. She resumed her work, redesigned a building downtown, attended charity events, and yet, every time she closed her eyes, she saw dunes. Every time the wind blew through the city's avenues, she heard the whisper of desert winds. The heart she thought she had healed now ached in a new way, not from pain, but from longing. One morning, as she walked through a park near her apartment, Elena stopped by a street musician playing an oud. The sound, haunting and beautiful, transported her. The music didn't belong to this place. It belonged to sand and stars, two horses galloping across moonlit plains, two eyes that had once looked at her as if she were made of constellations. She sat on a bench and wept quietly. Unnoticed by the passing crowd, it was then she realized the truth. She hadn't left to find herself. She had left to test the strength of something that didn't need testing. She had fled from the very thing she had always been searching for. Love that was real, patient, unwavering, and now she had a choice again. Weeks later, back in the desert, Akil stood once more on the palace balcony at dawn. He no longer searched the horizon. He no longer waited. He had let her go because he loved her. That was all he could do until he heard the sound of hooves on stone. Turning slowly, he saw Ahmed, the old tracker, riding toward the palace gates with a rider beside him.
A woman.
She wore a simple linen scarf. Her skin was sun-kissed. Shaded but unmistakable, Elena dismounted before the guards could react. Her gaze locked with Halil's. "I couldn't breathe without you," she said. Halil descended the steps in silence. When he reached her, he took her hand without a word, placed the stone pendant she had given him into her palm, closed her fingers around it. "I was always yours," he said. They embraced beneath the arches between the sand and the sky. Two hearts that had wandered far enough to know where home truly was, not in a place, but in each other. Destiny fulfilled. The wedding was not meant for the world, though the world would eventually hear whispers of it. It was not designed to dazzle cameras or parade status, but to honor a love that had bloomed not in palaces or ballrooms, but in wreckage, in silence, in the arms of a stranger beneath a sky full of stars. The Palace of the Seven Winds was transformed for the occasion, not with extravagance, but with reverence. The great courtyard, once a place of formal receptions, had been softened with white silk canopies and scattered petals from desert flowers that only bloomed once a year. Incense floated gently through the air, blending with the scent of citrus and fig. It was as if the desert itself, had been invited to witness the union. Elena stood before the mirror in a gown crafted by local artisans. It was not white, but a deep ivory, with embroidery in gold and soft red that mimicked the shifting lines of the dunes. Her hair, loosely pinned, held a single blossom, the same kind she had once seen from the palace balcony when she had almost chosen to leave. She no longer felt like a guest in this land. She had become something more than she had imagined possible. A partner, a consort, a soul rooted not in geography but in shared purpose and chosen love. Queen Amina entered the room quietly, watching Elena with the warm gaze of someone who had once stood in the same place, feeling the same mix of wonder and courage. She stepped forward and placed a bracelet around Elena's wrist, a simple heirloom, worn smooth by generations. "My mother gave me this on my wedding day," she said softly. "She told me it was a reminder. Royalty is not in blood, but in the grace with which you love." Outside, the courtyard filled with those closest to the kingdom, tribal elders, scholars, families who had served the dynasty for centuries. They sat in quiet anticipation as Khalil emerged, robed in ceremonial, white eyes fixed on the path where she would appear. When Elena stepped into view, there was no fanfare, no music, only the breathless silence of 100 hearts holding still. She walked slowly, each step a promise, each glance a memory. And when she reached him, Khalil took her hands in his and whispered something only she could hear. "I found you once. I would have found you in any lifetime." The ceremony itself was brief but sacred. Vows were spoken in Arabic and English, alternating between two cultures that had once seemed worlds apart. Rings were exchanged, simple, bands engraved with the coordinates of the crash site, the place where everything began. When the final blessing was given, and the two were declared husband and wife, the courtyard erupted not with shouts or clapping, but with soft rhythmic drumming, the ancient music of the desert, echoing through the palace walls like a heartbeat. In the days that followed, the kingdom welcomed its new princess, not with pomp, but with poetry. Children sang songs about love found in fire. Women brought handmade gifts, symbols of endurance and joy. And Khalil, who had once ruled with solemn wisdom, now walked with lightness, as if love had softened the very edges of time. Elena, in turn, embraced her new life, not as an outsider, but as a bridge. She learned the language with quiet determination, sat in council meetings with curiosity and grace, and began projects that uplifted women and children across the kingdom. She brought architecture from her past into the soul of her present, redesigning orphanages, clinics, and schools with warmth and functionality. She never forgot Washington. She often spoke with her sister, who visited and wept at the sight of the palace. She kept a journal, documenting her transformation, her fears, her hopes. And though she could have returned at any time, she never did, because she no longer needed to escape. She had arrived where she was meant to be. 1 year after the crash, Elena and Khalil returned to the site. It was quiet, as it had always been. The wind moved the sand in soft, relentless waves. A small memorial had been built, hidden from the world, known only to those who had been part of that moment. Elena knelt before it, her fingers brushing the engraved names, her heart full of reverence. "Out of sorrow," she whispered, "life was born." Khalil stood beside her, silent. After a time, they walked hand in hand away from the wreckage, leaving behind not grief, but gratitude. That night, back at the palace, they lay beneath the stars in the same garden where she had once questioned everything. Now there were no more questions, only quiet, only peace. "I used to wonder if love like this was real," she said. Khalil turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Now you know it is." Their fingers intertwined, a gentle knot that held the story of every choice, every risk, every breath between life and death that had brought them here. And so it ended, not with a roar, but with a whisper. A love born from the ruins, sustained by trust, tested by distance, and fulfilled in the desert that had once promised only silence. But if you've come with us this far, you know now, silence does not mean emptiness. It means waiting, listening, trusting that some stories are written not in ink, but in survival, in touch, in destiny. And now, dear listener, if this story moved you even just a little, I invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next powerful tale written in the winds of the impossible. Tap the notification bell to be the first to witness every heartbeat, every moment, every miracle we bring to life. And if Elena and Hal's journey reminded you that real love exists, leave a like to help this story reach others searching for hope in silence. Because sometimes, to find the extraordinary, we simply need to believe that destiny, when it's real, never arrives quietly. It roars in flames, it whispers in deserts, and when it finds you, it stays forever.